And what we have then, in some ways, is 34 different stories, a different chemistry here about who is competing. Hazaras against Hazaras, sometimes Pashtuns against Pashtuns, sometimes a question about which ethnic group would have fair representation. But it's, unfortunately, we're not going to see very much disaggregation of what occurred. And the reason I think this is important is, and I say there are different stories, is as our people came back, they came back with quite different accounts of what they saw. Naturally, we did not see the worst of anything. We didn't last year, as bad as that election was, and a large part of that reason is that the voting stations that we visited, and I visited some 19 in Kabul, and where it was easier to get around. Wherever we went, we found a high degree of professionalization in the process. We found that with a few minor infractions, people were playing by the rules. And it may very well be that in 30, 40, 50% of the voting centers out there, and there are some, in the end there were some nearly 6,000 voting centers, each with a number of polling stations, that in those places, the election took place on a fairly prescribed basis. Whereas we learned from some of those people who came back, and certainly from other information that we have since had about the enormous cases of wholesale fraud. The most egregious of ones, of course, we saw last year, and repeated to some extent, to a lesser extent, because some stations were taken out, some centers were taken out because it was so insecure they knew they couldn't hold a fair election. But even so, in the southeast of the country, we know that we got turnouts in areas in which there were bound to be very few voters, turnouts which were coming in at 115, 120%. You'd think they would have learned from last year's election that if you want to get something thrown out, this is the way to do it. Well, let me make some generalizations about what I do think we can get with this election. I think it is fair to say that the election was dominated by local power brokers, provincial power brokers. Are running either themselves or their surrogates competing for those positions. And again, everybody got one vote. Everyone had one vote. So in Kabul province, everyone had one vote, even though there were 33 candidates. And you had to go through 12 pages of pictures of each of the candidates to check it off. And yet I found that, I don't know others, that people pretty much came in, knew who they were going to vote for, and they got it done within 3-4 minutes. They didn't go through all 12 pages and mull over them. So that went, I thought, rather different than I thought it would. But that power brokers were important, it should come as no surprise. In our own elections, obviously, money and influence count. And so I don't think that is surprising, but what is surprising is the extent to which some of them can at least affect a great many votes. As I say, we saw some retail fraud, minor kinds of infractions, which wouldn't affect the outcome very likely. But it was in some provinces, obviously, where there's a great deal more of this. But what is absent here, and the distinction from last time, what's absent here is the kind of national orchestration, as we saw when President Karzai was able to appoint large numbers of people who brought in the votes, particularly in the south and the southeast of the country. We didn't have this because there was no force that was organized on a national basis that was going to determine the outcome. So it's different in that sense. President Karzai, although he's anxious to have a parliament which will be far more deferential than the previous parliament, nevertheless does not have that kind of organization in which he could assure a organized, mobilized effort here to control the vote nationally. Now, 3.4 million voters supposedly turned out. We may see some changes in that, and that's by any standards, given the fact that there are 11 million or so potential voters, but not all of them could vote because many voting stations, 1,000 voting stations, or centers rather, were closed down. So they then adjust that downward and they come up with a figure of perhaps 35% or so. But how do we interpret that? You could interpret that as, gee, that's a lot of people who came out, in spite of the fact that this country is in the midst of a war. And there were all kinds of threats being made against anyone who had any ink on their fingers, which is the way in which you identify that you actually voted. You know, it's Pakistan, which didn't have a war going on in the election that Carolyn and I observed, didn't have a very much higher percentage turnout. So now we're looking at the fact that we've got a country largely illiterate, largely dispersed, even more so than Pakistan in terms of ability to get to the polls. But nevertheless, it will be judged in the fact that only 35% turned out to vote. There are many, many complaints that we know have been registered with the Complaints Commission, and probably most of them are valid. But after all, if there are only 249 seats, and actually fewer than that because 10 are reserved for the nomads, and that was a national vote. But with the 249 seats, that means there were about 4,500 candidates vying for the 239 seats, 249 seats. There were a lot of disappointed people. And undoubtedly, as we saw last time, and we see in other elections in the area, one way in which you excuse the fact that you didn't win is to say it was stolen. Now, it doesn't mean that this person is not able to come up with some evidence here of there being irregularities. But stolen here means that they would have won otherwise. And that's going to be a far smaller number. I would also submit to you that a lot of the fraud that we have picked up here is of a variety which is not unusual even in this country. And that is what you have are party workers, or candidate workers in this case, since parties did not figure in an important way. You have candidate workers who want to demonstrate to the candidate that they're aligned with just how well they can bring in a vote. And what you get, therefore, is an embellishment on a vote so that a candidate who would have won with 4,500 ballots cast in the province gets 9,000 votes. His people enthusiastically bring in, and that accounts for a good portion of the votes that are stolen. In other words, they're stolen votes for a candidate who would have won anyway. And therefore, it does not directly affect the outcome.